So for today, we have three presenters, and I'll tell you just a little bit about them. Our first presenter will be Melanie Heckel. Melanie has a bachelor's degree in political science from UC Davis. She worked as a land use planner for 2 counties and is AAUW's public policy chair. Thank you, Melanie. We have Elaine Sierra, has a bachelor's degree from CSUSF and a law degree from UC Berkeley. She's a retired attorney and director of public policy for Citizens for Choice, who have a table over here. Thank you. We can wave at them. The next presenter is Professor Megan Seeley. She has a bachelor's degree in international relations with a minors in women's studies and Latin American studies from CSU Chico. She also has a master's degree in sociology from CSU Sacramento. She's a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at Sierra College, Rocklin campus, and she specializes in women and gender studies. So we have a wonderful panel, and I will now turn it over to Melanie.
Thank you very much. As Diane mentioned, it's been mentioned many times, but back in August, I was asked to come up with a public policy program for March. I didn't know what kind of a state our country would be in, or women's rights, and so I gave it this vague name, Women's Rights in 2025, Gains, Losses, and Where Do We Go From Here? Turns out it's been extremely timely. It was timely in March when we were going to meet in March during Women's History Month, but we had low snow and we had to reschedule it for today. It's way more timely even now, 3 weeks later, because so many things have been happening just in the last 3 weeks. I am honored to be with my co-panelists who are experts in the field, and I'm not, but I did design and create the name of the program, so I decided I didn't want it to be all negative, and I did say gains, and so my part of it is to, I picked that I wanted to talk about the gains over time, and I was going to keep it mostly in the 20th and the 21st century gains for women's rights, but I had to put in something in the 19th century. Because in 1978, former Nevada County resident Senator Aaron Sargent introduced the bill to give women the right to vote, and he and his wife Ellen, and they campaigned many years, even alongside Susan B. Anthony, for women's suffrage. Unfortunately, they did not live to see it happen, but at least women finally gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. Many women worked outside the home during World War II and gained independence and a self-worth through working outside the home. But when many of them had to give up the jobs when soldiers came home and wanted their jobs back. Now most women are in the workforce, whether they want to be or not. And but with hearing from Ria, hopefully most women are doing what they love. And so we're in a new world, for sure, than we were back in the 1950s. In 1973, women gained reproductive choice, allowing women to make decisions about their body through a Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. Now, this is my first time trying to move the slide. We'll see how it goes. Yay. And my notes. The gender pay gap still exists, but has been reduced since the 1950s. The pay gap in the 1950s remained at 60%, meaning that women earned only 60% of men's pay. I was very surprised to learn that it fell below 60% throughout the 60s and 70s. That really surprised me, and I was in the workforce in the 70s, and I guess I didn't realize that. Finally, in 1980, it went back up to 60.2%. In 1990, it made it to 71.6%. The wage gap reduced further since the turn of the century. So in the year 2000, it was 73.3%. Moving on up to 2010, it was 77.4%. And in 2020, it became 82%, and that's where it stays today, somewhere between 82 and 83%. Let's talk about women in leadership. history of women in the U.S. Congress. Of course, in the session, the congressional session, 1970 to 1990, before women's suffrage, there were no women in the Congress. But the very first time that it was possible for a woman to be elected, there were 4 women, 1 in Senate and 1 in the House. So we did make progress immediately. And then during World War II, there were no women in the Senate, but there were 11 women in House, so making a total of 11 women in Congress. And going on up to 1920, women in Congress had increased significantly, where we had 9 women in the Senate and 56 in the House, for a total of 65. Thank you. And where are we now? So this year, right now, 2025, there are 100 Senate members, 26 are women, so obviously that's 26%. In the House, there's 435 members, 125 are women, 29%. So we have an overall rate number of women in Congress is 28%. Oops. Good news for the California legislature. 37% of the Assembly's 80 members are women, and yay, 50% of the Senate in California are women. So we are parity. And the overall percentage of women in the California legislature is 41%, but we're not that far from getting parity, and we do have it now in the Senate. Let's talk a little bit about the Equal Rights Amendment. Excuse me, I'm losing my notes here. It was first introduced in 1923. The ERA is a proposed amendment to the Constitution that reads as follows: equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And the Section 2 would give Congress the right to enforce it. In 1972, Congress passed the ERA and sent it back to the states for ratification. It required 38 states to ratify it by 1982. Sorry, my notes are mixed up. What happened next? The ERA failed to be ratified by 38 states by 1982 deadline. In 2020, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify. And legal challenges remain because the 38th state did not ratify on time. Just a little bit about the last 2 administrations. Sorry again. I should have figured out how to. Here we go. So during the first Trump administration, conservative majority took over the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court. Betsy DeVos was named Secretary of Education and took the opportunity to roll back the protections of Title IX. What happened during the Biden administration? In 2022, the conservative U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, protections for women's right to choose, despite the fact it had been in place for 50 years. The Biden administration restored and expanded on Title IX protections, but they didn't become effective until August 1st, 2024, so just last August, and we all know and we'll be learning more about what's happened since then. President Biden issued a statement that he thought the ERA should be part of the Constitution, but it has no legal effect. Lawsuits will continue. Project 2025, we're all learning a lot more about that, but in October 2024, I listened to an AAUW California sponsored webinar about the impact of Project 2025 on AAUW priorities. AAUW California public policy priorities consist of 4 pillars: equal access to quality public education for all students, economic security for all women, social and racial justice for all members of society, increased representation of women in leadership roles. AAUW California predicted that Project 2025 would directly impact all 4 public policy pillars. So we're seeing that all occur. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Elaine Sierra.
Thank you, Melanie. And thank you for providing that important information. One of the things that caught my attention was the number of women that are in the California legislature. And because Citizens for Choice and our partner, California Coalition for Reproductive Freedom, are focused on California legislation, we are beneficiaries. It used to be very difficult to find people who would sponsor the bills that we wanted to improve reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, and now there are many that are very, very supportive of us. And I want to thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I am a sister, I am a member of AAUW, and as well as the Public Policy Director for Citizens for Choice. I'm going to address the state of reproductive health and rights in California and a little bit about the national landscape to fill in a little bit more detail from what Melanie's already talked about. But first, I'd like to point out the Citizens for Choice table over here. It's staffed by our outreach worker, Sandra, and one of our board members. And I hope you'll stop by and see what information they have and how you can share your ideas. And AAUW and Citizens for Choice are kind of joined at the hip. One of your past presidents, Marion Becker, was a co-founder. She was a nurse, and as a student nurse, pre-Roe, she witnessed the death of a woman from a botched abortion and asked a doctor, how can this happen? And he said, because of the laws. So it was very personal to her, and it should be personal to us all to think about women's lives just being wasted like that because of a refusal to offer care they need. AAUW and Citizens for Choice share a mission of equity for women, and including promoting reproductive health, rights, and justice. Citizens for Choice fully supports and joins in one of AAUW's key aims, promoting access to quality, affordable reproductive health care. I'm certain you're all aware of the chaos arising from our new national administration. You know that cataclysmic and sudden changes are happening, but you might wonder at the effects on reproductive health and rights. I'll try to reference some of that. First, the cutbacks and redirecting of our tax dollars to new and different priorities. Funding cuts and changes to how the executive branch and federal agencies operate are too numerous to discuss fully, but let me just highlight a few that may have the great impacts. These all threaten to decimate the availability and the affordability of reproductive and general health care, especially to our most vulnerable populations, including low-income women. First, the cuts to Medicaid. Medicaid is really a critical program. In California, Medicaid provides health care for 1 in 5 Americans, and I think 1 in 3 Californians. It includes seniors, people with disabilities, children, and low-income adults. Likely cuts to federal funding, the programs, and the staffing could force states to restrict eligibility, cut benefits, or slash provider reimbursement rates because there is not enough money to backfill the loss of all those federal dollars, and it affects the whole statewide budget when you have a bigger pot to draw from. Medi-Cal, which is Medicaid in California, is the nation's largest state Medicaid program. It provides free or low-cost health care coverage to about 15 million Californians. Over 60% of Medi-Cal's budget comes from federal dollars. So cutting federal dollars will certainly harm the Medi-Cal program and its beneficiaries. The examples of some of the Medi-Cal services that might be cut is pregnancy-related care. California provides Medi-Cal coverage for all eligible pregnant people who reside in the state, finances 40% of all births, and after birth, it covers infants until they turn a year old. Another important benefit under Medi-Cal is sexual and reproductive health care. Medi-Cal offers contraceptive care as well as services for sexually transmitted infections, urinary tract infections, and screenings for breast and cervical cancer. And there is a special federal program, Title X, which is the only federal program dedicated to providing family planning services to low-income individuals. March 31st, 16 grantees received notice of the temporary withholding of funding for their grants, effective the following day, which is typical of how this administration is working. There's no forethought, no warning, it just happens. California and Planned Parenthood were among those notified. That impact could be that over 800,000 of the patients served annually by Title X, 30% of those served, would lose access to care. A third major cut is cuts to the Department of Health and Human Services and other health-related agencies. The Department of Health and Human Services has had 10,000 voluntary resignations and now just issued orders to 10,000 more workers that they're no longer needed. The HHS agencies affected include the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the National Institutes of Health. At the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest funder of medical research in the world, stop and think about that and all the benefits that come from that, has a budget of $48 billion, and its research mission is going to be hobbled. Staff cuts have effectively ended a lot of the work on HIV prevention, for example, and many NIH research grants have been cut or terminated, some related to sexual and reproductive health. And I'm aware of several going to UCSF that have been cut or terminated. Another major cut is to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. CMS oversees more than $1.5 trillion in healthcare funding for elderly, disabled, and low-income people. Cuts so far include the staffing of offices managing discretionary grants, which you can see the grants are, and many of the grants are being eliminated. And of course, they've eliminated the Office of Equal Opportunity and Civil Rights under the rubric of ending diversity, equity, and exclusion. A lot of women's programs are being targeted. If you just have equity in your name or in your materials, you're a target. How can we counter these federal actions? Well, we must work together, and I know AAUW is at the state level and at the national level. And what is Citizens for Choice doing? We are working, as I said, with the California Coalition for Reproductive Freedom. It's a coalition of some 40 organizations. At the federal level, we monitor the shifting situation and how it might affect reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice. We send letters to Congress and key legislators asking them to oppose cuts to health care, particularly Medicaid. We monitor sexual and reproductive health-related litigation. For example, there's a case that was just argued before the Supreme Court called the Medina case, and that issue is the right of beneficiaries to choose their own provider. In South Carolina, they banned Planned Parenthood from serving Medicaid patients, even though a lot of patients rely on low-income Planned Parent services, and despite the fact that there was no concern with the quality of care. One of CCRF's member organizations filed an amicus brief in that case. That was the National Health Law Program. And at the state level, which has up to now has been our, our major focus. Now it's had to be expanded to be able to respond to federal actions. But we advocate for legislation focused on reproductive health and rights. Later this month, we'll be lobbying state legislators during what we call Reproductive Freedom Week. Our priority bills, we have a whole list, but some of the priorities include improving sexual health education and youth access to contraception. We have a very good sexual health statute in California, but it's not really being enforced or implemented in many of the school districts. So this would allow the state to monitor it a little bit better and make sure that more districts are in compliance with its requirements. Another bill would facilitate the availability of alternative birthing centers that would just focus on birth, because a lot of maternity hospitals and clinics are closing because it's not a money-making proposition. So a lot of them are just closed, and that means that a lot less access to women, rises in maternal health and infant mortality that really we don't want to see. Another bill would expand and improve access to reproductive and sexual health care in emergency departments, so they're prepared to deal with miscarriage and emergency pregnancy situations. What we can all do, we all need to stay informed, which I'm sure, depressing as it is, we're all trying to do because it's our civic duty. We have to keep calling our lawmakers. Our Citizens for Choice president, Karen Haig, who's a wonderful woman, says that she calls our legislators every day, and there's always an issue to talk about. And keep putting pressure through rallies. April 5th, there was a big nationwide rally, and there's going to be more. And find your activism level and what you are willing to do. Indivisible Women is a local organization that will keep you informed of in-person activism you can do. So I'd like to commend AAUW for its public policy priorities and for its steadfast commitment to women's rights. I mean, it should be our right. I mean, it is our bodies, and it should be our decisions about whatever we do. And it's only a human right to be able to have access to health care to effectuate that. So thank you for your attention.
I was joking that we all needed a Barbara Boxer box. Do y'all remember when she was running for office? Everywhere she went, they carried a box for her to step up on. I always think I need that. My name's Megan Seeley, and I just want to... Oh, yeah. I am very loud. Okay, I should hold it. I'll hold it. How about, because I move too much. My name's Megan Seeley. Thank you so much for inviting me and including me in this morning. I just want everyone to take a big, deep breath. Thank you, Elaine, for all of that information. Melanie, yeah, so much daily, so much is happening. So much around reproductive justice, of course. I was asked to talk specifically about education, which I will, but one of my passions, of course, is reproductive justice. And in fact, what I did to start my slides is my brain dump. So I don't know about y'all, but this is like on the regular, the stuff that's floating in my head that I'm like, we have to, what? Now, hold on, wait, this is the next thing. Oh my goodness, what's the latest? What's happening? And I love the activist advice about pick a topic and focus on it, because otherwise you're gonna burn out. Yeah, I'm gonna do that one day, but in the meantime, I've yet to burn out, and I've been doing this for a long time. I actually got my start as part of the United Farm Workers movement when I was 13 and 14 years old. I grew up in a little town outside of Watsonville, California. Anybody know Watsonville? It's called Aromas. If you've ever driven south on 101, there's a big red barn. That's Aromas. So I was really involved with the United Farm Workers Movement. So I've been doing this for activism for a while, so I haven't burned out yet. But and part of the reason why I don't burn out is because of stuff like this. And so as I'm going to dive into yet even more bad news to share with you all, I also think it's really important to hang on to our hope. And our, for me at least, hope comes from stuff like this. And when we come together collectively, that we are not on our own. We are not on our own. We are not on our own, you know, when we come together, we are really powerful. And I think that the opposition, the oppressors, if you will, really, really work hard to make us believe that what we think is just ourselves, that we are by ourselves, that we are on our own. This only affects us. These are only our stories. Nobody else shares them. And they couldn't be more wrong. And it is their attempt to divide us. And when you look around this room, clearly it is not working. When you look around what happened on April 5th across the nation and indeed the world, it is not what's happening, right? More and more voices are raising up. More and more voices are sharing their stories. And when we do that, we're able to see how we are connected in our shared experience. And it is shared. And what we are going through right now is collectively shared and a collective trauma on the daily, and that is also part of the strategy, right? This chaos that's coming out of the administration is intentional to divert our attentions, to dilute our attentions, to wear us out, to burn us out, to confuse us, to overwhelm us. And so it's really important that we continue to push back against that chaos, because it's part of the strategy. And in doing that is going through the details and the information and the things that are going on so that we can stay informed and so that we can share information with other people, that we can dispel myths and misinformation, because there's a lot of that happening in the Trump administration as well. No surprise, we know who Trump is. He told us a long time ago. So this is what's in my brain. And I am going to focus on education as I was asked to do, but I just have to say a couple little things, especially following up, Elaine, from what you were saying too, like the recent cuts to Title X, I think are among many things so critically important. But one of the things I just want to mention in addition to what you said is that disproportionately, the folks that are going to be affected by that are our independent, freestanding feminist clinics like Women's Health Specialists, which I believe is who partners with Citizens for Choice here in Grass Valley. They are one of the few that serves very rural and are most at risk folks who need health care. We also know that there's a linkage between reproductive health care and gender affirming care, both under attack. So we're partners in that and in that addressing of access to body autonomy. So I just want to throw that out there in addition to all the amazing information that you just shared. And again, daily, these things are happening daily, right? The other thing that I wanted to mention before I focus specifically on education, because of course, you know, it's all interrelated, is HR 22. And I'm going to imagine that many of you are tracking this as well. But HR 22 is the so-called SAVE Act. And I love acronyms. Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. Which is the ultimate irony, because the only thing it needs safeguarded from is the folks who wrote this kind of stuff. But, you know, it's under the guise that somehow we have all these non-citizens voting on our elections. And the ultimate irony of Trump trying to address voter fraud. And I'll leave that there for y'all to consider. And I just reminded that these are all being recorded. So, yes, nonetheless. But what I do want to say about HR 22 that's really, really important, and just as by way of context, this is a bill that will require a really undue burden of proof of eligibility to vote, including a variety of different identifications. So one thing you may have been hearing a bit about is that one of the biggest impacts it's going to have is on folks whose names don't match their current IDs don't match what's on their birth certificate. Okay, so who is that, right? So the vast majority of women who have married have changed their name. So their current name is different than that which is on their birth certificate. Anybody who has a dead name, who has transitioned gender, has changed their identity, have come into themselves, into who they really are, and their birth certificate name is what we refer to as a dead name, their current ID is not going to match either. So the volumes of people that this will disenfranchise is huge. So you all probably know this part of it, but I also want to make sure you know that on Thursday, it was passed in the House, along with 4 Democrats who voted in favor of it. So, and of course the GOP did. This now goes to Senate. So, here we are. So, following up again, I'm just going to keep piggybacking on the things that you said. Make some phone calls. I'm like calling daily too, right? Adam Schiff and I. I'm kidding. He does respond, but I think they're blanket. Anyhow, but call. Send messages, emails. I know some of our elected officials also block your, if you're out of district, who you can message or whatever. There's some ways around that. But so messaging people, messaging senators right now in particular, because that is profound. I mean, it's staggering. Anyhow, I'm gonna leave that there. So, and I'll move on to specifically about education, although these are a lot of things in my head. And on that note, I have a lot of notes because, goodness sakes, so many things have been changing, rapidly changing. Even in these 3 weeks from when I was gonna come initially to now, I was like revamping stuff. So I'm gonna rely heavily on notes, which I don't often do, but if anybody has a better way to keep all this stuff in your head with the rapid changes, please let me know. You need some mnemonics. Okay, so it's specific to education. I'm going to look kind of generally at education, and then we'll talk about higher education, which is my background, where I'm at. And there's lots of crossover in terms of the impact. And I just put some key things that I think are maybe most central to what's happening in education. So, of course, our Department of Education cuts, right? So a lot happening around here. We've seen notices went out to 1,300 people working for the Department of Education, terminating their position earlier this week. We know that Secretary of Education Linda McMahon's charge is to effectively eliminate the Department of Education. And while there was some speculation, question, conversation, no, that's not really true, what have you, we know that there's now an executive order as of May 20th to do exactly that. And so she's got her job, and she knows what she wants to do. The interesting thing, and you'll hear people push back as this is a good thing, when people argue that this is a good thing, one of the things that you'll hear people say is that what Trump really wants is to return the power to the states. And this is a common theme with the GOP, except for certain things. But anyhow, like reproductive justice. But okay, so the idea about returning things to the states so that states can have control, and they often reference things like, another state shouldn't be subjected to our radical progressiveness of California, right? And so the thing that's tricky about that is that has not been helpful when we look at serving the majority, right? And so if you recall, one of the reasons why we have the Department of Education is because states wouldn't adhere to federal laws and court decisions, right? Things like desegregation of schools, right? So there is a reason why we centralized our efforts for education, right? In terms of what the structure of our schools look like, who had access to schools, and so forth. And I can get into a whole history about education, mass education for Americans and what it was really rooted in, which I'm going to try not to do because I don't have that much time to do that. But we have mass education for all. It was not altruistic. And it was really the idea to conform a growingly diverse population into the ways of the folks who were running the country at the time. So our education has never been historically rooted in equity and justice. And so the efforts that we've seen over the last, decade and a half or so, to infuse things like equity in our educational practices are for good reason, because the history of our education has not been based on that, right? And so that's the other big attack that we see happening from the Trump administration against education, is everything under DEI. They love to throw that around too, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The interpretation of what DEI is from the Trump administration is really bizarre and somewhat fascinating. I don't know why I do this, but I frequently find myself watching our press secretary. And I do need to stop. But the number of times that she just references things as DEI, right? Anything and everything is DEI. And as was mentioned earlier, we're seeing funding being removed from programs if they have just simply have the word equity, or if they have a reference to a community of color, if they have reference to women, they're just pulling funding, right? There's been so many fascinating mistakes under this practice as well. There was a program that was funding was removed because the person's last name was gay, right? So, but it, the filter grabbed it, and so we, and this is part of that chaos, right? These massive actions, and then whoop, 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 wait, we didn't mean that. So I also think we have to be really, really careful about being clear about what we're talking about when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So if we look at a history of an educational system that was not inclusive, did not include all the experiences, doesn't tell the truth of our history, right? Doesn't center voices that has been historically not just marginalized but oppressed and left out of the conversation, then we're not telling the truth of our history. We're not telling the truth of our experience. So including diversity and equity and inclusion is about centering voices that have long been marginalized. That's a richer, more robust understanding of who we are as a culture, right? That's a really powerful and beautiful thing to do, right? It's also more accurate. Right? And so this pushback that we don't want to tell the stories of anybody that are not cisgendered, white, predominantly male, self-defined Christian, it's not that those stories aren't valid and true. That's part of our story, but it's not the only story. So to remove all those other voices is really dangerous, really dangerous. And as we're certainly seeing, it is emboldening a white nationalism in this country that is damaging and dangerous. And we've been here before, right? We know this. We know where this is going. DEI was an attempt to start countering some of these things, right? It's also really important to note that DEI is vast, right? When we talk about ramps for people in wheelchairs, that's DEI. We talk about lactation centers for breastfeeding students, that's DEI. Right? So this umbrella that's catching all these programs in the midst are fixing to remove so many resources, so much education and information, so many narratives that we will lose if this is successful, right? So the pushback, and we're going to talk about the pushback, that's really, really key. Okay, so connected to that, there's a couple things that are happening, right? Executive Order 14190, Executive Order 14168, Executive Order, he loves executive orders, right? 14151. So all of these are somehow connected to the things that I just mentioned. So let me just go through really briefly about what these are. So the 14190, ending radical indoctrination of K through 12 schooling. This order prohibits K through 12 schools from teaching materials that the Trump administration has deemed un-American or anti-American. So that includes, by their definition, this indoctrination of gender ideology. And remember, one of the first things that he did upon his inauguration was declare that there are only two sexes, right? Which has had a number of cascading impacts, right? Also just wrong, both by science and by lived experience. So I don't know where you put more weight, but in both of those examples, we have both a scientific basis to say that that's incorrect, and we also have a lived experience that says it's incorrect. And I think both of those things are valid to lean on when we look at people's experiences and lives. So there are also attached to this executive order criminal investigations that are allowed into educators that are found to be facilitating transitions around gender for minors. This is tricky because the imagery that is being shared around this is that somehow there are gender-affirming care resources happening in elementary schools, or that teachers are taking their children and walking them across the street to I don't know what they think is across the street, but anyhow. So this is, I mean, our teachers are they're in so many spaces and doing so many things. Performing surgery is not one of them. But what I think we have to be careful about is that this imagery that people see and think is happening is fear-mongering, and it's also part of that chaos, right? Because what is happening then is that a teacher who honors their child's preferred pronouns or name, right, are now subject to criminal investigation, right? So they create this facade of like, oh, this is what's really happening, right? There's surgery in room 4. But really what it's doing is creating this avenue to then institute criminal investigations. And we know this because it's happening. The first teacher was just arrested in the state of Florida for using a child's stated pronouns. So here we go, right? Okay, so we gotta pay attention to that one. Executive Order 14168. This is the gender ideology one. This is the order that specifically defines a person's sex based on the sex at conception. This is what he said, sex at conception. Y'all know life begins female, right? So, this is still in effect, and there are a lot of challenges, legal challenges constantly around these. And this executive order particularly important because it's been foundational to a lot of the other things they're pushing forward, right? And I already kind of mentioned and talked about the inaccuracy around that. Okay, 14151, ending radical waste and government DEI program and preferencing. This eliminates the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across any federal agencies, including the Department of Education. We've already seen that happening. Removing DEI initiatives from a lot of different programs. I'll talk a little bit more about that with higher education and the threat to higher education. But what we know is that removal, as I've already kind of mentioned some of this, but we know that the removal of these kind of programs disproportionately affect women, people of color in the educational setting, limiting their access to resources, whether or not they see themselves reflected in the curriculum, whether or not their stories are told, which ultimately is about belonging, campus climate, connection. We know all of those things lead to whether or not they have a sense of belonging, connection to curriculum, see themselves reflected, have direct correlations to success in education, right? And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but we have studies that show that. Most of you in here know that, right? Okay, so then also withholding funding over transgender athlete policies. This is another one that the Trump administration's all over. The interesting thing to me about this, and I don't know that how many people are really tracking this, but the policies that he's initiated or his administration's initiated around transgender athlete are all about trans women in women and girls sports. There's no conversation about trans men in men and boys sports. And I think that is important to note. I think it's very telling. And I think it's absolutely rooted in gender stereotypes and misogyny, right? The idea that there's no threat by trans men participating in quote-unquote real men's sports, so we don't have to pay attention to that, which I find very offensive, among other feelings. But so the policies that are being instituted around our trans athletes are all targeted at trans women. And this is a hot topic, right? This is a big issue. And people have lots of different feelings about that. We won't get into it right now. But what this does mean is the removal of funding federally from programs and athletic programs. It also has been used as a, threat, leverage from the Trump administration. Some of you may have seen the governor's conference at the White House a month ago, something like that, right? In which Trump called out the governor of Maine for not adhering to the new trans policies around athletes. And she stood up to him. She continues to, by the way. Watch her. She continues to. But following that, within days, the Trump administration ordered the pausing of their USDA funding to Maine. So not even just funding around trans athlete programs, but funding through the USDA that was directly related to nutrition programs in their educational system. So he's holding hostage funding that from Maine because they won't play ball. That was a bad pun, sorry. Okay, and then impact. Oh, I meant to pay attention to time. I talk too much. Somebody just check me if I'm getting too close. Title IX. Title IX is big, right? So Title IX is about gender equity in education, put into place in 1972. We've never really totally been in compliance. Lots of information. We heard a little bit already about Title IX, right, earlier. Just in way of an update, what I'll say is that with this second Trump administration, what that did is it put us back to 2020 regulations. And so the Biden administration had expanded, so we pushed back to 2020. So that means that trans folks are not covered under Title IX in terms of the 2020 initiatives. The other big thing around the 2020 requirements is the removal of a lot of protections for victims of sexual assault, right? So and I won't go into too much detail. There's so much detail about the investigation process and so forth, but it takes protections, supports, removes trauma-informed approaches to sexual assault in educational settings. And it effectively, DeVos, if you remember, made this argument when she was Secretary of Education, made this argument that the Title IX process of investigations really put an undue burden on perpetrators of violence and that we needed to worry about their futures and their reputations. It was the Brock Turner argument, right? Y'all know who Brock Turner is, the Stanford rapist. And that undue, like these poor men who might have their futures ruined, it was that kind of approach, and centering the protections of the perpetrator over that of a trauma-informed approach to investigations and victims of violence. What has happened, though, is that the state of California has some stronger protections that we're able to rely on, and we're not as long as we're not in violation of federal law, we can continue to offer a lot of the things that we've been doing. For example, at Sierra College, where I work. And so we're able to, in California at least, able to do a little more than what is required under the 2020, because the 2020 sets a minimum, but doesn't push forward additional regulations yet. We'll see what happens with the Trump administration. So I will say with Title IX at the college level that at Sierra College at least, our primary focus or primary need for Title IX is around pregnant and parenting students, which I think is fantastic, and I think has a lot to do with our outreach and education around Title IX covering pregnant and parenting students. And so what we've done at Sierra College is increase our lactation centers. So we have multiple locations at the Rocklin campus and a location on all of our campuses, including our NCC campus, of lactation spaces for people to breastfeed or to pump, which is so key as someone who had 2 babies and have way too many stories of trying to breastfeed or pump in public bathrooms. It's so disgusting. And in my car, which is the story of most breastfeeding people who have to be in public spaces, right? So we've been able to really address that quite a bit. We also have a really robust Title IX program at Sierra College that works really closely with our campus community in terms of our policies and so forth. And specific to this area, at our NCC campus and the Godoti program, which is a high school-based program, our Title IX team works really closely with the Godoti program and our participating high schools to create education and protections for our students that are also high school students. And there's some different regulations and so forth that are needed when they're minors versus not minors, but we are addressing those, which I think is really, really great. And in terms of our policy around trans athletes at Sierra College, we follow what's called the 3C2A requirements, which allows for students to play in athletics by the gender they identify with. So we're holding strong on those things despite what's happening on the Trump administration. So I took a side note just to give you a little update on Sierra College. Where am I on time? I forgot to pay attention. Oh, okay. I'm good. Okay. Okay, so then specific to and some of this I think I've talked a little bit about, but specific impacts on higher education. We're watching closely, of course, the cuts at the Department of Education because particularly concerned around student access to federal loans, to financial assistance that are controlled federally as opposed to what's happening on the state level. We're seeing a lot of colleges and university losing funding because they're doing equity work, as we were talking about earlier, just the inclusion of a community color or the word equity or even women, colleges are losing funding over that. Colleges have responded in a couple different ways outside of California. Some are capitulating to the Trump administration. Some are changing the language in their public documents and forward-facing information so that they're essentially still doing what they've been doing. They just call it something different. And then there's also a series of legal challenges around all of these things. There's lots of legal challenges on the daily happening all over the place. Just a side note about that, while I think we absolutely need to be filing legal charges and supporting the programs like ACLU that are doing so much work right now. Legal challenges are really important. But we also know that the Trump administration is largely ignoring everything legal. So the courts tell him or his administration they need to do this, and they ignore it. Or they delay so long that there's nothing to be done by the time they are held accountable. And I think we have to push back against that as well. I know that there are many law firms that are meeting with him and making deals, which I think is gross, and we should call them out and hold them accountable, and they should all be disbarred or whatever that process is. And then there are law firms that are banding together and fighting back, and there's quite a few of them in California that are doing that as well, right? And in fact, there is, what was the one that, there's a big lawsuit that California, there's a coalition of 21 Democratic attorney generals in democratically led states that are pushing back as a collaborative about the Department of Education cuts and changes. So I think that's important. Okay, we also, we know there, again, I think some of this is a duplication, but pushing back against critical race theory and gender ideology. This is so interesting too, like the critical race theory, first of all, I'm not really aware of much critical race theory being taught in elementary school. Although, as a sociologist, I think it's a great idea, right? I think we should be teaching critical race theory in elementary school. Because critical race theory, again, as I mentioned earlier, is centering voices that have been largely marginalized from our context and from our discourse. And why would we not include those voices? When we look at how we teach what we teach, it plays a role in what we do in our future and how people see themselves, right? And the United States is notoriously poor at teaching the truth of its own history. When you look comparatively to, for example, the way Germany now handles the history around the Holocaust, vastly different than what we do in terms of our own history. Germany has educational curriculum that's real honest about what happened in the Holocaust. They are not celebrating the perpetrators of genocide. They don't have statues to Hitler. They don't have a curriculum that celebrates this time in their past. They talk about it as the embarrassment and the shame of their own history, and let us not repeat it, and here's why. We don't do that. We don't do that at all, right? Critical race theory is an attempt to do those things, right? To tell the truth about what our history is. We have schools across this country, disproportionately in the state of Texas, for example, that want us to believe that slavery was just a business proposition, and these folks had jobs, right? That's a problem. That's a problem, right? So, critical race theory tends to show up more in colleges, because I think at that point we're able to tell more of the truth of our experiences. We also are more likely to have programs like ethnic studies in higher education, although more and more high schools are doing that as well. And of course, in the state of California, we've now created an ethnic studies requirement, right? That's a good thing, because we're going to learn more about people that don't look like us, right? And by us, that means all of us, right? So the opportunity, no matter what your race, ethnicity, gender identity, gender association, any of that is, the opportunity to learn about people who are not just like you creates a more robust experience, right? Okay, so we're also seeing a reduction in funding for research institutions. A lot of updates around that. Some pretty critical healthcare and medical research institutes in universities that are losing funding, and other funding, particularly if there's anything that is in any way related to equity, that funding is in jeopardy. We also are seeing a loss of funding to programs like NOAA because they study the climate. Did you hear that? This is new. This was just this week too, that because they study the climate, which is their purview, But because the assumption that that might be associated with climate change, right, or environmental degradation, they're now losing funding. So I'm not quite sure what how far impacting. Like, I rely heavily on my weather app. I mean, not to make this about me, but I'm a little worried about that because I like that app. And if we can't track the weather, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I mean, truly think about our farmers, think about our emergency response teams that are tracking hurricanes and tornadoes and the pilots, yeah. Woo! Lots of things, right? We, of course, free speech and protest. We are seeing people abducted from colleges right now because they are raising their voice in opposition to the Trump administration. We have, over 300 people that just recently got their educational visas revoked because of some belief that they were against the Trump administration, or they spoke out or protested. These are disproportionately international students. These are disproportionately students of color that are using free speech rights to raise their voices about any number of different issues and experiences that are being stolen. They're being stolen without due process, without notification. Their visas are being revoked without notification, and then they're in violation of the law, which is how the Trump administration is saying they're justified in being abducted. We're watching very closely about the people who've now been whisked away to prisons in other countries without due process. I don't know what happened to the rule of law, but it's not being followed, right? So no due process. And in a country that prides itself on free speech, if you are a person of color speaking up right now, it's very scary. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. And so, how can white folks stand up as allies in this is an important question that we should be asking. Okay. And then women's studies, women and gender studies programs. We're already seeing that even in California. Sonoma State has just announced that they are terminating their women and gender studies program at the end of this semester. San Francisco State is not terminating their program, but they're combining programs with a couple other colleges in order to survive. We know the CSU system is hurting financially, and anytime there's financial hurt, it's women and gender studies that are going to go first. So these are things that we should be paying attention to. I frequently have students in my women and gender studies classes that tell me things like, I changed their lives, this class changed their lives. I've had students leave abusive relationships that they've been stuck in for years. I've had students be able to take control of their own body autonomy in a variety of different ways because of the things that they read about or heard about or the resources that were shared. I've had students tell me that it was the first time they ever heard a story that sounded like theirs. So these are things that aren't directly measurable. But they are real, and they happen, and they do change lives. And to lose programs like Women and Gender Studies is so devastating, particularly to communities that need that kind of support. If you think about our LGBT students, they're disproportionately at risk for suicide. They're disproportionately at risk for violence. And to have a space that belongs to them, that they can learn about their own stories, the stories who came before them, it's invaluable. It's immeasurable. And we're seeing a great threat to these programs. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. Okay, so I think I've mentioned a few things. Our own AAUW, big statement. This was a few weeks ago against the Department of Education cuts. As I mentioned, there's 21 attorney generals from democratically led states that are in a lawsuit around the cuts to the Department of Education, saying he doesn't have the right to do it, to dismantle an agency created by Congress. Lots of lawsuits, like I mentioned, a lot of lawsuits. Sadly, one of the lawsuits was about cuts to the teacher training, and the Supreme Court just ruled against it, which is unfortunate and not a surprise. Lawsuits around educational grant funding, lawsuits around against the DOJ and their cuts and their overstep in colleges and universities. As I mentioned, some are renaming the DEI programs to keep doing the work. California has doubled down, right? California has said we are continuing our DEI programs. We're going to continue to support the protections that those programs have. We're going to continue to support our colleges and universities from doing the work that they've been doing. Right? We had a big dear colleague letter come out a couple weeks ago from our Chancellor's Department for the California community colleges saying, go forward. We are doing what we do, right? So let's hope that continues, and let's support that on the statewide level. Things that you can do. We've already had a few things mentioned. there's a lot of heaviness in these conversations and a lot of the kind of bad information or the bad news information. I'm an activist at my heart, always have been, even in my family when I was 5. They have stories. So which then I, by the way, got paid back because I have 2 daughters that frequently hold sit-ins and protests against me. So be careful what you raise. My mantra is that I'm raising them to be the women I want to see in the world. As children, not so much. I wish they would just do what I say. Yes. Be informed, research, ask, discuss, text, call, email, support women's studies, LGBT studies, ethnic studies. The economic pressure is working. We see it working. Community activism, we mentioned the April 5th, of course. There's another economic blackout planned on April 18th. April 19th, there's the 50-51 is doing another day of action. AOC and Bernie Sanders was coming to Auburn. You all know they moved to Folsom Lake. Okay, so that's April 15th. They're coming to Folsom Lake College. Look, y'all are already active. You're involved. You're here. You work with AAUW, amazing organization. We already heard some of the things that AAUW is doing. Spread the word. Share the information. Find your community. Y'all have. Stay involved, stay engaged. The approach to chaos is to get us to disengage, right? So we have to not disengage. We do need to safeguard our energy. I think that sometimes when the stakes are so big and things are happening on the daily, we can feel guilty if we take time for ourselves because there's so much to do. We got to take time for ourselves. You can't give what you don't have. And if you're depleted, you can't give anything, right? So take care of yourselves. Renew your energy in all the ways that you do. You all live in such a gorgeous, beautiful place, right? On the river, out in nature. Take your shoes off, put your feet in the dirt. These are things that help me. Y'all live in Grass Valley. I'm expecting that it helps you, right? But keep finding your community, right? Keep building that community. Look at this room. Be proud of what you built here as an organization, and keep reaching out. So lots of information. I realize lots of ways to take action. I know that we're going to do some Q&A, so I'm going to leave you with this slide. I'll fast that one. I did a presentation for a group of high school activists, and so I was wanting to put together some information for them, and my old school 1990s self started to make a flyer, and I was like, what are you doing? They're in high school. It's 2025. So I put together a little website-y thing. I'm sure it's completely hackable, but because I don't know how to not make it that. So that's a QR code. It allows me to keep things up to date. So there's like actions you can take, things you can do, current events, and then also just like my contact and stuff like that's on there too. So if you're so inclined, if you care, if you would like that information, feel free to share it. It's just a Google site, so I'm sure it's my creativity, but.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Megan. I'm just going to be extremely brief in my wrap-up. This part I'm not even going to talk about because we've gotten so many good recommendations about staying informed and taking action from our other speakers. But I want to mention the 19th. Someone told me about it. It's a daily email that you get called the 19th. So if you just Google the 19th, you'll find it, and you'll get daily news about what's happening that affects women. And of course, partnering with an organization and attending more protests. I just want to say that's important, and Megan certainly gave us a good idea on that. I'm not going to talk about lobby days. I'm going to have it in the newsletter, but it is the time when AAUW lobbies the California legislature once a year, and I did go down with Lisa Schliff over here, over there, there she is, to lobby on Tuesday, and it was very interesting, and I will, in the newsletter, talk about those bills, so that was a good experience. And I want to, and this again, under good news, celebrate and support our Tech Trek and local scholarship because it's what makes us all feel good. And I think that and about the future of the world. And I think all my colleagues on all the different scholarship committees would agree with me that February, March is an uplifting time when we're reading the scholarship applications all these young women who are so bright and so ambitious, and they want to help people, and they want to change the world. And it's such an antidote to the lack of care, the cruelty that we're seeing coming out of the administration, the national administration. And I just want to quote one of our applicants this year. She is hoping to major in statistics, sociology, and her career goals are to be a data analyst and a social worker. And she said, I would like to work with families in need, helping them get access to resources and support. I believe this would be immensely rewarding, as I have always had a passion for helping others. Let's encourage those people, for sure. And just to finalize it is that our guest speaker, Professor Seeley, was eligible for a $100 honorarium and $80 for her travel costs, which we gave her, and she turned around and dedicated it to our local scholarship fund. So I'm very proud of that and excited about that, and I hope that encourages many of the rest of you to donate to our local scholarship fund. All right.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to take a few minutes for questions. And
Well, my question, which I sort of know the answer to, is how do they make illegal teachers acting on legally required actions like the Disabilities Act and civil rights legislation that have mandated many of those programs and curriculum in the schools? How can a executive order override that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I don't know that I have the perfect answer, but I will say that this administration seems to mistakenly believe that an executive order is law, and it is not. It also mistakenly seems to believe that the president has rule over Congress or things that are congressionally created. Bondi just said that in I don't know, I think it was a cabinet meeting to Trump that he does in fact have that. So if your own AG is telling you that, it's problematic. It's absolutely problematic. I also think, in my opinion, that part of the strategy is they're doing things that they know will be legally challenged, and that there's so many legal challenges, it's hard to keep up with them, and that they either ignore the rule of the court, or they delay and delay and delay, as I was saying earlier, until they're, what do we do? Like, it's all, either it's destroyed and there's nothing to come back from it, or the damage is done, right? So that seems to be a bit of a strategy from what I'm observing. But no, I mean, these are, repeatedly, we're seeing things that are rooted in law or congressional act that the administration has decided they can trump.
fantastic. Any other question here?
Hi. Well, first of all, I really do think that your first act of feminism should be getting a podium that is more suitable to women, and the fact that this is so tall is patriarchy is built into our architecture of everyday life.
I would like to just interrupt for a minute and tell you that the number one item in the info in the ideas box is to change the podium. So you are on the, but it belongs to the church, so we can't do anything, but go ahead.
I'll build you one. Okay, I will. So my question is, and I just want to introduce myself. I taught in San Francisco. I taught women and gender studies, LGBTQ studies in high school, in public high school in San Francisco, and my students were hungry for it. It did change their lives. Being able to talk about abortion as a fact of life and reproductive justice. I mean, just having it not be shameful, which was, a large part of their families, being able to be an ally to queer kids. I'm a queer woman myself. And I've recently retired. And so I'm wondering, how can we, help LGBT queer studies, women's studies, any kind of things like this? How can we more directly help instead of just advocating for it? What can we do?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think word of mouth, spreading the word that these classes are important, or the impact that they've had on you or other people. Enrollment is at the college level. Enrollment drives what we do, right? If I don't have enrollment, as you know, right? I mean, if I don't have enrollment, I don't get to offer a class. And I have to just say that I'm a little boggled by how low enrolled my women's studies classes are. The departments, not just mine, but both online and on ground. I'm a little boggled. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, I've long taught a course I wrote called The Sociology of Women's Health that looks at sociopolitical realities around women's health and bodies. And historically, that course has always been over-enrolled, like wait lists, the whole thing. I thought when Roe v. Wade was overturned, that course would be high demand. I can't fill it. I currently have a class called Feminism and Social Action. Can't fill it. In fact, it was supposed to be on ground so that we could these great ideas to split time between like the classroom lecture, if you will, and then I was doing in-person like workshops and speakers and activities and so forth. That was a brilliant idea on my part, by the way. But the class didn't make on ground, and I had to move it online, and it's really low enrolled. So I don't know, like I'm trying to figure out what is happening. Like I thought that when the threat was as great as it is, the students would come for sure, and that's not what's happening. I have a couple theories on what's happening, both connected to politics and also to kind of everyday realities around scheduling and coursework and GE requirements and pathways and all these things that nobody really should have to suffer through. But I do think like that is a boggle to me. Like, so I try to promote those classes in the department, not just mine, but those classes across our campus, across our communities, and really promote those things. So word of mouth is really helpful. Building enrollment would be helpful. I think it's also really great to share knowledge. So if you have an expertise that you can speak on, let me know, because I have a feminist chat series right now that I'm trying to host that is bringing speakers to share their own experiences, their own expertise, their, what have you. So building those kind of things. We do a lot of events at Sierra College to bring more attention to our LGBT studies and to our women's studies program. AAUW's long been involved in those events, both at our NCC campus and our Rocklin campus. People showing up in those spaces to say these things are important is important. I think in terms of the overall cuts and so forth, reaching out to the systems that are doing the cuts and letting them know, like, this is not okay, and for these reasons, and this is the impact it's had on you, is important. The scholarship program that you all do as AAUW is hugely, look at the impacts that it has into the future on these women who work with AAUW and are able to see themselves. I've been involved with Tech Trek before. The program is freaking awesome. Like, it's so amazing. So the fact that you all continue to do that and fund it and get scholarships for kids to participate, like supporting those kind of things, I think are really, really important ways to continue to promote those programs. And I'll think on more ideas.
Other questions?
Do we have one right behind you, Carolyn? Rhea.
Sure, I have actually two. One of them is, are your classes available through the OLLI program for elders and seniors? Because Sierra College has a program, and every one of us could sign up. OLLI, oh sure. Yeah. Well, why not? But I know we're short on time, so second question, when I know of GSAs, I don't know if they exist anymore, the Gay Student Alliances, and they always have a faculty sponsor, and I'm wondering if those faculty members, that I believe they do that as a volunteer, but I'm wondering if those faculty members that sponsor these support programs at the schools for gay kids are under attack, are being protected, if there are lawyers that are set up to help them, something on that effect. Because I would see them as being really frightened, and maybe GSAs closing across the country as a result.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too. So I would add to to what your question too is that, supporting those programs. We have a really active Rainbow Alliance and a Spectrum Committee and a faculty advisor over our Rainbow Alliance at the college level. But in Placer County, there's been a lot of attacks on this particular. You're all not Placer County, sorry, Nevada County. In Placer County, where my campus is, there's been a lot of attacks on this. They're all up in this area as well. So I think when those things happen, being front and center at those hearings, at those school boards, run for school board. I've always said if I run for office, it's going to be school board. Shit happens at school boards. And we know it's a training ground. Conservatives know this, right? They start conservatives out at school boards and build them up, and then they're in Congress. So, run for school board, show up to school board meetings, speak out, especially if we have a teacher that is being targeted for supporting queer youth. Absolutely be at the front and center at those meetings, fill the streets. And I think for so many reasons, one, because that teacher needs it, but also those students need to see that there's more than just the one teacher that's been there for them. And pride events and pride events I think are so important. I also love this program that we're seeing all over the country of the, I don't know what it's called, like adopt a parent. Like I'm going to stand in as a parent for a queer youth who doesn't have a parent they can turn to. I think that's incredible, right? The more that particularly queer youth see people who are in their corner and supporting them, the better, because there's so much rhetoric in our communities and nationwide that would have them believe that there's something wrong with them. And the more they can hear that there's nothing wrong with them, that what's wrong is a system that is broken, the better, I think.
More questions?
Well, we are going to leave it there for questions. And I want you to hold that thought about school boards, because if you've been reading your AAUW numerous emails, you'll see that there's a lot of focus on school boards, and we'll be bringing that to the program meetings in very specific ways about what's happening in Nevada County. So, yes.
The clinic here in Grass Valley, but I also have an independent practice as a college advisor. I've had it since 2011. I was trained in 2011 through UC Berkeley. Sorry? Oh, okay. My name is Leslie Roberts. I'm a new board member with Citizens for Choice, which helps fund the clinic here in Grass Valley. But I also have an independent practice as a college advisor. I've done that since 2011. I was trained through UC Berkeley. It's just important that everyone knows that beginning in 7th grade, there's something called concurrent enrollment. Students can enroll in community college classes for free. So as we're helping to guide young activists, particularly high school students, if her courses or any of the courses in that department are CSU UC aligned, it's one of the wisest things a high school student could do in terms of their college applications to take courses like Megan's for a variety of reasons, but that would certainly help with enrollment. So make sure your nieces know, your neighbors know, your daughters know. That would be a brilliant way to help support that.
You know what? I want to keep this conversation going, and we're going to do that next year, because we're going to focus on school boards and what's happening and keep this very important conversation that Melanie started for us going next year. So we will want to thank our panelists in just a minute. Yeah, but first I want to remind you that we will see you all on May 6th at the luncheon. Now, thank you very much.